Welcome to the Misfits Guide to the Bible.
Where the curious, the skeptical, and the strange find a home.
I'm Jonas Worthy.
And I'm Sam Smith, and together we will embark on a journey through the Bible's wild side.
For those who don't quite fit in. Welcome in. Today, if you can't tell, we have a special guest with us. Do you want to say your name and say why you're here?
My name is Paige, and I am here because I support what my husband is doing.
Yes. So this is my spouse, and we are, as you couldn't tell, married. Yep. So Sam is going to have to take some breaks a few times. I've decided that we'll kind of try to keep a weekly thing going if we can, and try to bring on different guests. And this week I decided to bring on my spouse. So
Yep, Sam's living large, doing big girl things.
yep, Sam's got jobs and school and things like that to worry about. So
Yep.
today just wanted to kind of get into both of our journeys through faith a little bit, I guess. So this one is going to be less from an experience of people who were never in religion, and more coming from people who have deconstructed and kind of come out of that faith, specifically Christianity. But we can kind of get into a little bit of what your background was. I've shared a little bit about my background, but we can kind of talk about that together.
Deconstruction.
Yeah.
Scary word.
Maybe. Okay, so why don't you just tell everybody a little bit about your life growing up? What was church life like? Did you go to Sunday school? Were you involved in youth group? And then after childhood, what was your involvement in the church? Were you still heavily involved, or did you begin to start taking a step back from faith? Why don't you go ahead and
So you're
share your
asking for
story.
my testimony right now?
No, not your testimony.
Okay, so I am a woman of color. My parents immigrated from Vietnam, and my dad is a pastor. And so growing up as a Christian was never really out of the question for me. Like, I was destined to be a Christian at some capacity. And so my journey with faith ebbs and flows, like a lot of people's journeys do. I would say I didn't really get serious about my faith or Christianity, or really engaged in that, until probably in middle school is the first time that I remember like having my first Jesus awakening experience. I was involved in youth group. In fact, Jonas and I were pretty heavily involved in the youth group. We were seen as like quote unquote leaders, and so I am a person that does things like 110%. So if I'm like in it, then I'm in it, and if I'm not, then I'm not. I went through a journey in high school where I was like not really feeling this faith thing through because of a couple of experiences. And so because I wasn't feeling the faith thing, I wasn't going to church, did not go to youth group, which was kind of abnormal for me at the time because I was heavily involved. However, I gave my life back to Jesus. And my junior year of high school. And so my senior year was like, my goal was basically to be the Jesus freak and the person that everyone looks up to in terms of like faith. So, yep, pretty heavily involved in church. Then Jonas and I started dating our senior year. We both were really involved in the youth group. Knew pretty early on that we wanted to get married, which was fun for us. So we've deconstructed a lot of things, but our commitment to one another hasn't been a thing that we've deconstructed, which has been nice. So being a woman who was brought up in the church, I felt like it was my role to support Jonas in his ministry. And so with that being said, the commitment that we had in youth group carried on into college because Jonas was a youth minister, and so I helped him a lot with his ministry and that. And then when we got married and moved out of college, we were like heavily involved in church. We did all of the church things. We're involved in the youth group. Like, I mean, we were there at church probably at least 3 times a week.
Yeah, sometimes more.
Yeah, sometimes more. And so all that to say is I was a huge Jesus freak. I wouldn't consider myself an evangelical Christian now, but I would still consider myself a Christian. And I would like to say back then, before we've deconstructed, if people looked at our lives, they probably were like, yeah, they love Jesus, or the way that our life looked like really reflected that church was something that we cared about. Our faith was something that was really important to us.
Well, at least that's what I hope people understood.
Yeah,
Now
that's the
they,
hope. Yeah.
Now they probably wouldn't see it that way. But
They're probably like, they did something wrong and
Probably.
they deconstructed.
yeah. So why don't you talk a little bit about walking away from the Christian tradition that we grew up in?
Okay, that's a great question. So growing up, I had a lot of questions. I'm naturally just like a really curious person. And I don't know if this is just like me being stubborn or being like, can we cuss on this one? Yeah. Being like, fuck you to the church, basically, because women are supposed to be like really submissive. So I don't know what it was, but I basically had a lot of questions about a lot of things, like why can't women be in the ministry, or like why do we hate gay people, and all of that stuff. So I had a lot of those questions growing up, but at the end of the day, I kept saying, well, like, God is good and his plan is perfect. And so whatever the case is, that's the case. And I believe in God's provision. I believe in God's plan and his mercy and his grace. And it got to the point where that answer just couldn't cut it for me anymore, especially in terms of the treatment of the LGBTQ plus community. Because it just, one of my very, very good friends, I remember having a conversation with her. I don't know how familiar this is for all of y'all, but I was side B for a really long time. And my friend who...
Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so there's different ways to view the LGBTQ plus community. And I only have a limited knowledge of it. But side B basically is, in the front, you seem very welcoming and affirming, but the more that you dig deeper, the more you're like, oh, this person's not affirming. And that was me, because like I really did believe in having good relationships with people, loving people well, but through my lens of Christianity, what was taught to me, I could not love LGBTQ plus communities the way that they deserve to be loved. In a sense of like, didn't believe, I don't know, it's really complicated. All that to say is I had a really good friend tell me like, you know, I don't get it. Why do people who just have attraction to the opposite sex get to experience this love in this lifetime, but then people who are not attracted to like the normative, what is considered normal in evangelical Christians, why do they not to get experience love? And for a long time, the answer of like, well, God's way is higher. And like, if you really, truly love God, then you should be willing to sacrifice that. And my friend was like, well, why do they have to sacrifice it and we don't? Just because we happen to love the right person. And I couldn't shake that because she's right. Like, why do they have to sacrifice things that we don't? For what? Like, for what? Did God accidentally make people gay? Or are we deciding as evangelical Christians that that's wrong based off of what? And so that's kind of like really was the catalyst of my deconstruction journey, of the answers that used to be satisfactory to me no longer were. And the more that my faith was calling me to love people, my religion was telling me that I couldn't. So that's why I left the evangelical church.
Mm-hmm. Where would you say that you are? I know you mentioned this a little bit, but where would you say you are in your faith now?
Um, I think that's a little bit of a complicated question in a sense of, I don't know, because it's like easy to say. Back then, when I was an evangelical Christian, it was easy for me to just be like, I'm a Christian, and that's the truth, and that's the way, and like nothing can shake that for me. I would not consider myself an evangelical Christian anymore because I just simply cannot be tied to some of the things that the evangelical church does. Like, I am not okay with the treatment of the LGBTQ plus community, and I don't want anybody to think I'm associated with that or okay with that whatsoever. With that being said, I do believe in a higher power, and largely is because of my experiences growing up. Like, I really truly believe that I've had experiences where I've sat in the presence of God or sat in the presence of Jesus. Like, I guess a really evangelical term or Christian term, like spiritual awakenings. At the same time, I don't believe in hell. So I don't believe that if you don't follow my version of Christianity or this version of faith, then that means you're going to go to hell. I believe in a God that loves, and I believe in a God that is powerful in a sense of he wants all of his creation to be with him, and maybe he can't do that here on this earth, but in some way or form, he's going to work that out. And no matter who you are, you're going to see God again. Or I don't know. That part's a little bit complicated for me. All that to say is I don't believe in hell. I don't believe a loving God will send his creation to eternal damnation by any means. So, whatever is the loving way of eternal life, that's what I believe in, I guess.
Yeah, I think this is kind of where we've fallen in different places, I guess. And I guess the best way for me to describe this is to say that I'd say in some sense we are both agnostic, but I fall more towards agnostic atheism, whereas you fall more towards agnostic theism. And what I mean by that is just I don't see necessarily that there's any evidence for a God, but I don't know. And you do feel like there is evidence for a God, but you also would say that you don't know,
Yeah.
for sure as well.
Yeah, it's hard to shake my experiences and listen, I'm in psychology, like that's my field, and so I understand like the mind is a very powerful thing, and at the same time it would feel very invalidating to my experiences if I just chopped it up to my mind. And that's not to say that if that's where other people land, that that's a wrong place to land. For me personally, to validate my own experiences, my faith brought me through really, really tough times in my life, and I would like to believe that that was my encounter with God, and it would be doing my experiences a disservice, not giving credit to a God that I still believe in. But again, like, I am a person that believes what I believe, and at the same time, I'm not saying my belief is the right thing either. That's just how I make sense of the world. That's how I can understand a higher power and move in this world the way that I want to move in loving people well. And I believe that there are multiple ways to do that than just the way that I view the world as at the same time.
I think, obviously we grew up together, and so I think a lot of our experiences within the church are fairly similar. So I think that that's something that we found a lot of common ground on through our deconstruction, even though where we've ended up maybe is not always the same place. But I think that at the same time, like, we've both been able to find space for the other person's spirituality or lack thereof.
I will say two things about this. So one thing, something that Jonas and I shared in common always was loving each other well and doing our best to love other people. And that's one of the things I love most about Jonas, is that his commitment to other people and the human flourishing of other people. And so even though we landed in different places in our belief systems, our values are still the same.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And that's, you know, growing up in the circles that we did, we were always told, like, oh, if you're unequally yoked, or if you don't believe in the same thing, your marriage is not going to work out, or you're not going to have a strong relationship. And we're sitting here telling you, like, that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we do have different belief systems. And at the same time, it's still true that we have the same values. And we're learning to love each other, I would even say, even better, because we have different belief systems and creating space for one another. And that allows us to create space for other people in our lives who don't believe the same things that we do.
Yeah, yeah. I would say I think the important thing about this is sharing the same values. I think if you don't share the same values, that can be when your relationships with other people become difficult. But I think because we have both always shared the same values, even if like now our beliefs aren't the same that back those values, I still think that because those values are what's core to us as people, that's what's kind of kept us together and helped us kind of get through some of the harder times of deconstruction. So
yeah, and not to sound too Christian-y, but I am going to sound a little Christian-y. But like, you know, we are almost like a walking testimony in a sense of like, you can have different belief systems and have a really meaningful relationship and love each other well and still accomplish the things that you want to accomplish as a couple. Like, you don't need, I don't know what y'all's experience are for those who are deconstructing or like thinking about through their faith, but I was always told like your relationship's not going to be good, or your marriage is not going to be good if you're not equally yoked. And like, what does that even mean? You know, like to me, like having the same values means more to me than having the same belief systems but different values. Because like at the end of the day, if we believed in the same Bible, but I see the Bible as loving people well and Jonas sees it as following these rules, where does that leave us? What do we do with our lives? How do we love each other? You know? So
yeah,
that's just my, I guess, hot take on that. But
yeah, well, I think bottom line is, how can you hold space for each other when one of you thinks the other one is going to hell?
Yeah, that is the tough part.
Yeah.
And for us, we both don't believe in hell.
Right.
So
it
yeah, it works for us, I guess.
I guess if there is a hell, I guess we're going there together, because you don't follow evangelical Christianity in the right way either. So
Listen, babe, if you go to hell, then I'd rather be in hell with you
Okay.
anyways, so.
As you all know, this podcast is kind of centering around stories and how misfits interact with those stories. And so today we are going to go through another Bible story.
Uh-oh.
And yeah, we're not escaping the 20s. We're still in the 20s. We're not doing chapter 22, but we're still in the 20s. So apparently can't escape that. So I want to ask you, have you ever heard the story of Eutyches in Acts?
I don't think I have.
You might have heard of this story before, but you probably have not. You probably wouldn't recognize the name. You might have heard this story before.
Okay, so listen. Jonas and I's experience growing up is different in a sense of like he was really invested and was taught a lot of Bible stories and like a lot of like knowledge about the Bible, I would say. Well, and your seminary training too.
Yeah.
My experience, my dad's church was more focused on like spirituality over knowledge. And so, yeah, even though I grew up Christian my whole entire life, really believed in it, was like 100% committed. Don't come at me when I don't know these stories, because my dad's church valued spirituality more than the specific knowledge.
Yeah.
of it.
I'd see this one as really similar to the story of Balaam and his donkey, just because I feel like it's a story that is not necessarily shared a whole lot in Christian spaces. But this one is one, I don't know if I can ever recall a time where I talked about Balaam's donkey in church, like where it was outside of a seminary or a classroom setting. This one, I do remember it being talked about outside. But that being said, it's not a common one. It's not brought up a whole lot. And I would kind of see the back half of Acts. That's just kind of like I don't know. We didn't talk about the back half of Acts a whole lot. I mean, do you remember a whole lot about it?
I just also have a shit memory, so.
Yeah, but, well, I think the other thing too is that for me, this is actually part of the Bible that I don't know super well. Acts, like the first probably 16 to 17 chapters, I know pretty well. And that's because I took a Greek class, and that was part of it, was that we went through like the first, I don't remember, 16 or 17 chapters in Greek. And then the back half, we didn't touch it. And I just don't remember. This was one of those things that it kind of usually fell at the end of the semester whenever we were going through it in seminary and things like that. And so we just kind of sped through it and we didn't talk about it a whole lot. So this is part of scripture I don't know super well, but I can kind of situate it a little bit. So just give a quick background. So tradition kind of holds that Paul took 3 missionary journeys. So this falls in one of those missionary journeys. He took most of them to Asia Minor. That was where Paul was kind of doing his ministry work. So that'd be modern day Turkey, kind of Mediterranean area, around that area. I can't think of necessarily. My geography is, growing up in the American school system, so we don't learn geography super well. But it occurred kind of in that area. Paul, in his missionary journeys, he takes several different people with him. For the first one, he takes Barnabas. This one, he's got Silas on. And also there's the author of Acts, who is also presumably with Paul, because we start getting narration after chapter 16. So presumably the author of Acts has joined Paul on his missionary journeys at this point. So who is the author? Tradition holds Luke, who also, tradition holds, wrote the Gospel of Luke as well. So Luke Acts, we do know, is one piece, well, not necessarily one piece of work, but it is, it's complementary. It goes together. It's basically 2 different letters of the lead up to Jesus and what happened to Jesus, and then what Jesus's followers did after Jesus's death.
So was it meant to be one piece of work and we split it into 2, or was it meant to be written into like book chapters?
It seems that it's 2 separate accounts from the same author, because the way that Acts begins is in my first work to you, and it's written to somebody named Theophilus, and you could get into Theophilus literally just means friend of God. So it's kind of, people don't know, is Theophilus a real person? Is Theophilus, we do know that Theophilus probably funded the writing of these 2 writings, but beyond that, it's like, is it a real person? Is it some pseudonym for this person? We don't know, and it doesn't really matter. But bottom line, yeah, they were 2 separate works that were written for the benefit of this person who likely funded the writing of these 2 writings. This story comes from Acts 20. So this story comes from Acts 20. We are going to read 7 through 12. It's a short little story. Do you want to read it?
Do you want a popcorn read? Or do you want to just...
Nah, just go for it.
Okay, well, listen, y'all, I'm a little dyslexic. On the first day of the week, when we met to break bread, Paul was holding a discussion with them since he intended to leave the next day. He continued speaking until midnight. There were many lamps in the room upstairs where we were meeting. A young man named
Eutyches,
who was sitting in the window, began to sink off into a deep sleep while Paul talked still longer. Overcome by sleep, he fell to the ground 3 floors below and was picked up dead. Damn, he fell out and died? Oh, okay. But Paul went down and bending over him, took him in his arms and said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." So he raised him from the dead. When Paul went upstairs and after he had broken bread and eaten, he continued to converse with them until dawn. Then he left. Meanwhile, they had taken the boy away alive and were not a little comforted.
Yeah, we're not a little comforted. Have you heard this story before?
No.
You haven't heard it?
No.
I think we went through this story in youth group. I'm pretty sure we did. Yeah, with this story, I feel like it's not a super common story. So the key elements of it, you've got Paul is preaching late into the night. This was always the question that I had about this story. Is Paul just really boring? I mean, what do you think about that? Because this guy, like, is it just late at night, or is Paul just really boring? And this guy just falls asleep because Paul's so boring.
I do remember this being taught in this story.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, you talk a lot sometimes, but I don't think you're boring.
Well, see, but just because, I don't know, like, is it because it's late at night, or is Paul just really boring?
I don't think he's boring, though, because he had so much of an influence on so many people.
Yeah.
But also, I'm a firm believer that 2 things can be true.
Yeah.
So maybe in that moment, he was so boring.
He might have been.
And also, my mom and I... No, I'm going to stop telling on myself. What am I doing?
Yeah, and so Paul's preaching. This guy falls asleep and he's sitting in the windowsill, which also probably not the greatest place to
Maybe it was hot.
sit if you're tired, though.
But it might have been hot.
Yeah, you could sit by the windowsill.
What if he was having a heat stroke? Maybe Paul isn't boring, but it was a heat stroke and he fell out.
Well, it says he fell asleep. I don't know.
But you can fall asleep with a heat stroke.
Yeah. Anyway, Paul runs down the stairs after this guy falls out of the window and then revives him, brings him back to life. And then he just goes back upstairs and he continues preaching. Just goes about his day.
You know
It's
what?
like, cool.
Maybe I feel like that would have been a mic drop moment with my sermon.
Yeah.
If I was preaching and then I rose someone up to dead, I'd be like, enough said.
Yeah. It's like, all right. Anyway,
I don't need to justify.
Going on to the next town now.
Yeah.
You should all get it.
Yeah, exactly. That's just my take on it.
Yeah. Why do you think we don't tell this in churches a whole lot? You know, that was kind of a question I had for Sam whenever we talked about Balaam, but Sam doesn't necessarily have the intricate knowledge of the way that churches operate. So from an insider's perspective, why do you think that we don't talk about this a whole lot?
One, I don't think that people want to encourage falling asleep at church. So probably that, because it's like, what? Someone fell asleep during Paul's sermon. He was able to resurrect them. What are pastors going to do today?
Yeah, they can't top that. I've been to a lot of churches. They're not going to top that.
Do you
Just
think
trust
that, then do you think, so you teach this, someone falls asleep during church, and this pastor tries to resurrect you, and then they can't, and then that leads to the proof that God isn't real. And so I feel like evangelical Christians will not teach any narrative that alludes to the fact that their version of Christianity is not real.
Yeah. I think that's a good point.
And so, because there's just so much variability with that, I know, like, we're kind of talking extreme, like falling out of a window and die. But I think the underlying story is, if a story doesn't fit the evangelical narrative, then we don't really talk about it. Like, there is a lot in the Bible that I was not taught because it didn't fit this view of evangelical Christianity that I was taught to believe.
I think it'd be very interesting to see. I want to see Mark Driscoll or Matt Chandler or somebody like this. Whoever else, Josh Howardson, somebody like. I mean, they can't do it, and that's why I would love to see them preach over something like this, because
Okay, but who wants to be the guinea pig that dies for them to try that out?
Well, you know what?
Turn water into wine.
Yeah,
that's a simple one.
Go to a funeral home, at somebody's funeral, and instead of preaching about how great God is because God's going to resurrect us in the afterlife, why don't you just do what Paul did? Do what Paul did. It'd be miraculous. It'd be something that I couldn't refute if you were able to do that.
Yeah.
They're not going to, because they can't.
So, to answer your question, why did we not teach that story? Although our youth pastor did.
Mm-hmm. Our youth pastor was a little bit different from.
Yeah, that's a whole other story for another time. He was great.
He wasn't afraid of stories like that either.
No, he wasn't. Because really, at the end of the day, and I think the reason why we stayed Christian for so long is because of our youth pastor and his wife.
Yeah.
Because they encourage us to critically think and challenge our faith. And we continue to do that. And for me, I can't speak to your experiences. I continue to, this sounds really Christian still, I recognize it, but I continue to fall in love with God. And because I kept challenging my faith. Because like a belief that you don't challenge, is that really worth believing in?
Yeah, Sam and I talked about that whenever we did the Abraham and Isaac story of, this scared faith, is it even worth having?
Yeah, if you're going to devote your whole entire life to this faith that you're not willing to challenge, what are you doing? That is such a mediocre life, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And listen, y'all know now that I don't subscribe to evangelical Christianity anymore, but I still hold a semblance of belief. And Jonas might not hold a semblance of belief, but he values something that's meaningful. And I think to live a meaningful life, you have to challenge yourself.
What do you think is the purpose of this story? That's something that Sam and I have tried to look at with these stories. Why do you think it's here? And that's something that we kind of ask in seminary as well. What is the purpose of this story? Because it was put here for a reason. What do you think it was?
If I put on my evangelical hat, I probably would say that Paul is not fazed by anything and that he's going to continue to do God's work no matter what happens, mm-hmm. because he's that devoted to God. Mm-hmm. So that probably would be my question, or my answer to that question. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I don't know. I
think it could be multiple different things. I know that that's definitely evangelical answer of why it would be there. Historically and literarily, why it would be there. I think it proves the point that the disciples after Jesus, so we see Peter and John performing miraculous acts after early on in Acts, and then around